But you're still hammering away, David.
Well, because well, a couple of things. One is, look, I still believe, there's a great line in Robert Skidelsky's biography of John Maynard Keynes that I often quote when people ask me about my mother's influence on my politics, which is very large, but it's also true, as Robert Skidelsky tells us, that the biographer needs to remember that people are products of their times, even more than they are products of their background. And for those of us who came of age between 1977 and 1983, a time of tremendous crisis that is not like the crisis of today, but was in its ways as severe. We then, as young people, were casting around for answers to the problems of our time. And why was there inflation? How do you stop it? How do you stand up to the Soviet Union? Why are the cities in chaos? How do you restore order? How does America, how does the Western world regain its primacy when it seems to be losing it? And the great thinkers of the conservative world had answers that we adopted and believed and were then implemented and then led to positive results. And what happens is, in modern life, that one of the great danger in the life of a person, this is the great line of Machiavelli's, this is the tragedy of man, circumstances change and he does not, that you carry the things that worked in your youth with you into middle age and old age. But I still believe that for those problems, those were the right answers. And that vision of a society that was more spontaneous, that was more ordered by market transactions, where that had room for creativity and individual scope, where it was not just, where it was not just eat your peas and everything was the same. That offered something positive. And it's an ideal that still moves me. And I also feel that, through my, probably my one and only time in government probably, I was involved with people who did try to implement those ideas, and the results this time weren't good. And I feel a burden of responsibility about that. That you might say at that point, well, I'll do the Paul Bremer thing and retire to Vermont and paint. But it does seem if you've been part of the making of a mess, you have some obligation to stick around for the cleaning up.
Thank you. We have some time for questions from you. If I haven't asked them all, and I'm sure I haven't. So there's a microphone in the middle of the room, and we have about 15 minutes or so for questions. So if you want to, go ahead.
Hi, it's Christopher. I've been watching the, well, actually, let me start with a different story. There was an article last week that was talking about how U.S. conservatives really love British public intellectuals. It particularly named Hitchens and Niall Ferguson. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, yeah, I love them too. But then I thought to myself, there's so very few U.S. public intellectuals on the conservative side that I like. There's yourself, and you're Canadian. There's David Brooks, and he's Canadian. So are there any U.S. public intellectuals you enjoy? And beyond that, have you seen their birth certificates?
Christopher, I love Christopher Hitchens dearly, and Neil Ferguson I know a little. I don't know him as well. I'm much closer to his wife, Ayan Hersey, who's a dear friend of ours, and I admire him. But here's why you don't tend to see them so much in the United States. That the point to Christopher and the point to a lesser degree of Neil, is they were generalists. You put a drink into Christopher and you ask him about who should be the government of Indonesia, and he would have an opinion. You ask him about who's funnier, P.G. Wodehouse or Bob Newhart, and he has an opinion. He was a generalist, and he came from a tradition where mental agility, rhetorical creativity, that was the value thing. American intellectual life is much more technical and much more specialized. And so that kind of style, it's not really welcome. It's not produced by the system. So American public intellectual, I mean, the economists are, John Taylor, John Macon, who's an economist at AEI, whom I admire very much. He's an American public intellectual, but he's not going to give you an answer about P.G. Wodehouse. He's going to stick to M1, M2, U3, U6. And the same thing, and the people who do budgets and so on. It is just a much more technical, specialized intellectual life. And that job category of public intellectual doesn't exist because the institutions to support it don't really exist. That's why the Americans import them. They're bred elsewhere.
Do you think there's an anti-intellectual bent in American politics, that it's okay to drink a beer but not admit you eat arugula?
I often joke that the way you can understand American elite politics is it's a class struggle between people with more money than education and people with more education than money. And I think that the people, and both of them believe the other is the true American elite.
Right.
You saw this with Sarah Palin. I mean, even before Sarah Palin became the vice presidential candidate, the Palins were the richest people in their town. Todd had a very valuable asset, a salmon fishing license. That's a considerable piece of property. He had a plane. He worked in the oil business with his hands, but they were rich people and important people in their town. That's why she was mayor. But they didn't have formal education, very much of it. I mean, she, I think, had a BA, he did not. And they then felt very resentful of people who they thought were looking down on them. And now they have millions of dollars, and they still have that resentment. And other people who are assistant professors of English somewhere will feel, well, I have all these PhDs, but I don't have the money that the Palins do, and they look down on me. Yeah, and there's a famous book about the anti-intellectual tradition in American politics, but I think for the purposes of this question, that the key thing to understand is American intellectual life is a highly technical intellectual life. It is not a generalist intellectual life.
Hi, my name is John, and I had a business colleague in from Colorado this week who described himself as a liberal, but he was very pro-Romney and anti-Obama. And one of the reasons he was anti-Obama was that he said that the president was not pro-business enough. Is that a view that you would hold, and can you cite some examples of how the president might not be pro-business?
Yes. The stock market's up. People who have money are making money. Tax rates did not go up. And so a lot of the Obama people are puzzled. How can you say that? And the president takes advice from a lot of people, important people in the business world. But it's also very evidently true. And people who know him well confirm this. That's not his world. He never grew up in it. Nobody in his family did it, and none of his friends do it. And those of his friends who are in business and who have made money because of they've used their political connections to business advantage. That he's not surrounded by entrepreneurs and heads of companies. He's plainly uncomfortable with those people. He doesn't understand what they do, and he gives off a vibe of not respecting what they do. And this is especially damaging right now. To a stand in the business world, because Wall Street in the 2000s really disgraced itself. And there's a lot of anger at Wall Street. But there are a lot of people in the shipping business, in the information technology business, in the entertainment business. Our industries didn't disgrace themselves. We went on making excellent products and goods and services that met people's needs. And yet we feel this general mood of blame that is about the performance of this one industry and one section of this industry. And yet we all are now held to suspicion. And there's a president who seems not to get us and not to respect us at a time when we feel sensitive and under pressure. So I think that is what your friend is expressing, and I think he's capturing something real. And it's one of the reasons. I mean, I feel it's one of the reasons why I end up with all my reservations about Romney as probably a Romney voter, because the business of America is business, and he understands and respects the people who lead that business.
Thank you.
So a question about health care, being a dual citizen. Should Canada move away from our system, or should the U.S. move toward our system? Or what's your feeling about the role of government in ensuring health care to society on both sides of the border?
I think it would be very easy to take more of your time on this question than you have any patience for. And even if you have patience for it, then but let me just say this two sentences about it. It's a very unfortunate thing that Canada and the United States, both English-speaking countries, are right next door to each other on this healthcare question, because of the 24 plus countries in the OECD, almost all have some form of public healthcare provision. If you were to arrange them on a scale of most of least government to most government. Canada and Britain would be on one extreme of the scale, and the United States would be on the other. And because the two countries are next door, and because they speak the same language, that they assume it's a binary alternative. And you either have the American system with all of its ills, people don't get covered, there's a lot of waste and fraud, or you have the Canadian system with a lot of its ills. Andrew Coyne is here tonight. Andrew Coyne is the author of I think the greatest statement of the difference between the two countries, which is in the United States, in Canada, in the United States, not everybody has insurance, but everybody gets care. In Canada, everybody has insurance, but not everybody gets care. And on that scale, there are other countries that don't speak English and aren't next door have come up with some better answers than either of these two neighbors. And when you're looking for models, I would look there.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I grew up in Detroit, lived here for the last 30 years. Every time I go back to Detroit, I get gut sick at the devastation, the downtown, people are growing corn. I've read a fair bit of recently departed Gore Vidal. What's your thought on the future, the broad future of the American Republic?
Well, it's better than Detroit. You know, you have to be an optimist about the future of the American Republic. And when I say you have to be, I mean you must be, because otherwise what are you going to do? But Gore Vidal, Gore Vidal was a terrible crank, I must say. I met him in person only once. He was a great friend of Christopher Hitchens, and we would have many discussions about it. But I met him once. We're on the Bill Maher show together, and he was very patronizing toward me, which I think I didn't take personally, because he was patronizing to a lot of people. And one of the things he said at one point to Bill Maher was, if we had proper, fair elections today, the way they did, in the 19th century. And I thought, you have to really not know a lot about American history to imagine that elections today, for all their problems, are less fair than they were in the 19th century. And that's the kind of thing he would always toss off. I think Gore Vidal's general take on American society was that that America was a corrupt and damaged society because Gore Vidal, was not treated as an important enough person. And there was nothing wrong with American society that couldn't be fixed by treating Gore Vidal, as a more important person. and I think the beginning of, when I wrote my book about George Bush, left the White House, and I was prevailed on through a complicated story that I won't repeat to write this book, which I had not intended to do. But the book, I left in March. I started work on the book in April, and I finished the first draft in June. And I showed it to my wife, who reads and criticizes everything long form I do, who is not a gentle critic. And her first response to the first draft was, "Can we afford to give the advance back?" And so I went back and I talked to some people about so I had to finish the book between July and September. And one of the things I realized as I wrote this book, and it was a very just general insight to me about how you write things, was the defining experience that you have working in a White House is the experience of humiliation. You are constantly being reminded, and this is true for everybody from the vice president on down. I think it's true for the president often, and one of the lines in the book is, that one of the people who works for President Pulaski says, they always say the president of the United States is the most powerful man on earth. But from my point of view, that title really belongs either to the head of Patriot News, the governor of the Central Bank of China, or whichever asshole senator is choosing to make a nuisance of himself that day. But understanding that you're not, you have to deeply internalize your non-importance in the scheme of things if you're going to write truthfully about anything. And I think that was one of the problems that Gore Vidal had as a writer, especially in his later years. He could not internalize his non-importance in the scheme of things.
Particularly interested in your comments about the conservative movement and the Republican Party. Where do you see the strategic opening for those moderate Republicans, the moderate Republicans that may be left or that haven't left the party. Where do you see the strategic opening for them, particularly as President Obama exerts influence and is recognized for strengthening aspects of the Democratic Party that were previously their weaknesses? Foreign policy would be a prime example, and also on some aspects of domestic policy, the individual mandate, not 20 years ago, was a Republican proposal. Where is the opening for those moderates, given, isn't that real estate being squeezed between the right wing and the president?
I could answer that question, but I'm going to answer a slightly different question because I think it maybe is more useful for our purposes tonight. You can think about strategic openings and where they're going to be, but you're then subject to the fallibility of your predictions of the future. I think it's much more useful in political work to not worry about where the strategic openings are and to focus instead on what you're trying to accomplish, and not look at the position of the other runners on the track. Bill Buckley, in one of the things he gave an interview to Playboy magazine in 1970 that is collected in my favorite of his collections, and he said this is a very dark moment for his brand of conservatism. And the interviewer said, "What do you think you're doing? I mean, you're just losing all the time." And he said, "What I'm doing is I'm maintaining a landing strip in the jungle, in the hope that the planes will begin coming in. And when they do, coffee and Coke are on the house." That's what I'm trying to do. And you just, where's the strategic opening? Again, I can answer, but you just have to do it. And you have to do it with knowledge that it may not work out. Another of my, someone who's not here tonight, another school classmate of mine who wrote a very funny book, David Eddy, this is a line I often quote from his very funny novel, Chump Change. He said, one of his characters says, they laughed at the Wright brothers. Another of his characters said, yeah, that's true, they did laugh at the Wright brothers. They also laughed at all the people who jumped over the cliff, clutching their beanie propeller hats to their heads. So you might be one of those. You never know.
And just on that, do you think there'll be enough of the remnants? I feel like I'm one of those people who used to be a moderate Republican, and now I'm not that engaged in it. But do you think there'll be enough remnants of that base, the Rockefeller Republicans, left to come back?
I think it's actually growing because here's what's going to happen. Okay, this is the strategic question. A lot of the social issues are, when you look at where are they held, they're held most intensely by relatively small groups of older people in regions of the country that are not growing so rapidly. Meanwhile, the problems of how do you maintain middle-class incomes in a globalized world where they're huge, where in every country, more and more resources flow to people who have truly global skills and assets. One of the things I often point out is that the most famous American architect of the 1950s, the man Gordon Bunshaft, who built the Lever House building, built one building outside the United States. And he made a very good living, but he did not make hundreds of millions of dollars in the way that the celebrity architects of today who have global markets do. So if you are the best architect of the United States, that means you're the best architect in the world, and that means you're just a much richer person than your counterpart was in 1955. And meanwhile, rewards are squeezed at the middle, and manufacturing and things like that flow outside. That problem is going to be one of the great, if not the very greatest problem of developed societies. And we know President Obama told us what his answer was. He gave a big speech in Kansas in November of 2011, and his answer is basically more people work for the government because the government, as government contractors, because the government can guarantee middle-class standards of wage and condition. And that's an answer. And if you reject that answer, and more Americans will reject that answer than accept it, they're going to go somewhere else. And the negative things about the Republican Party, I devoutly believe, will fall away. They may not fall away on a timetable that is convenient to me personally, but they will fall away.
Thanks so much.
A final question.
Oh, hi, David. I was wondering if I could just ask two questions. Do you see the Republican Party as the British Conservative Party that had to lose so many elections to come to that point where they start delivering for the American middle class? And the second question, just very quickly, is on a foreign policy side. What do you see the odds of a military strike against Iran? Do you think it's because your blog picked it up? That's why
Okay.
I'm bringing it up.
right.
Do you think? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm trying to wear my novelist hat tonight, not my global pundit hat. So I will just say, to the second question, I will give you a very short answer. I would say the odds are low, but by both the United States and Israel. And for details, come visit the blog. The Republicans and the British Conservatives. The British Conservatives would have to, if they were more successful right now, I would think that that would be a real possibility. And one of the things that has been very weighing on the Republican Party is that the Cameron government has made decisions that have led to, I mean, Britain's recovery from the worst of the trough of 2009 has been worse, on a worse path than that of the United States. It's been worse even than continental Europe. So the British Conservatives don't look very wise, and they're not going to have a lot of supporters. And a lot of the things that David Cameron did to modernize the party begin to look like decoration. But on the core strategic decision, did you deliver success, that he's not delivering success, and that is going to impede his influence.
David, thank you very
Thank
much.
you.